Hi everyone, in this video I'll be going over progress notes, what they are, why we use them, and how to write them. We'll begin with distinguishing between progress notes and process notes or psychotherapy notes. So the progress notes that you write that describe what you did in session and what the client did and so on are part of the client's permanent treatment record. These are subject to audit, subpoena, or to a request for review of records by the client. On the other hand, process notes, which are also called psychotherapy notes, are something different entirely. They're not maintained in the client's treatment record, meaning that they don't go into the electronic chart that you're keeping or into the client's physical file at your office or your agency. Instead, these are normally kept in the therapist's notebook or journal and are kept anonymous. The moment you put identifiable information in them, they're no longer considered process or psychotherapy notes. They become progress notes and must be placed in the chart or shredded and disposed of if they aren't in fact progress notes and you accidentally put some identifiable information in them. These notes typically have ideas or thoughts that come up during session or as you're processing afterward. So if you're jotting down notes, for example, during the session of things that you want to discuss or things that you want to remember for the next session, these are typically going to be process or psychotherapy notes, okay? And you would keep them anonymous. Now, again, if they are notes that are describing what went on in session, the client's response, what they said, what they did, those are progress notes. So in this lecture, I'll be focusing on progress notes only. Okay, so the purpose of progress notes. Although they are often considered the bane of a therapist's existence, progress notes are an extremely important piece of therapy. They serve many purposes and, when well written, serve to protect you as the therapist. At their core, progress notes provide evidence of your services to or on behalf of the client. They're basically showing what you're doing to help the client meet their goals and providing a record of the client's progress throughout therapy. Getting more specific, we can think about their purpose in a few different categories. First is billing. Your progress note serves to justify your billing, right, or your payment, ultimately, for those services. You are charging an insurance company, the county, or the client a certain amount of money for the services you're providing, and your note is there to prove that your billing is justified. So if you're charging $150 per hour and your progress note says something like, "We talked about cheese preferences and the weather," this is obviously not justifying the charge. At the same time, if you're again billing for $150 per hour and you're doing an hour-long note, but your note is actually only 2 or 3 sentences, that is not justifying an hour of time spent with that client. So what you write needs to be detailed enough to show that you did in fact spend an hour with that client. The second reason why progress notes are important is for medical necessity. So in this case, our progress notes are there to provide continued support for the medical necessity of our services. You're demonstrating that the needs or functional impairments that the client has, which you are addressing in therapy, warrant therapeutic services. If every note you write says that the client has met their goals and there's not sufficient substance in the note to justify the hour of therapy, an insurance company may ask themselves and you why they should be paying for continued therapy if the client has already met their goals consistently. This would be similar to prescribing a patient some antibiotics when they aren't sick anymore, right? Another piece of this is showing that the services provided are in line with what you've diagnosed and the identified functional impairments. If you diagnosed major depressive disorder and you're treating the client for behavioral problems, this doesn't line up and the medical necessity of these services may be questioned. Another purpose of progress notes is for tracking treatment efficacy. Your notes serve to provide a record of treatment progress and efficacy. If your client has been in therapy for a certain amount of time and they're not making any progress, your progress notes should reflect this and should help you to recognize that you need to discuss this with your client and perhaps change your treatment approach. On the flip side, if your notes are indicating progress, it may suggest that it's time to reevaluate goals, maybe change them up a little bit to work on something different, or if you're done, to discuss termination. Finally, progress notes serve to assist with treatment planning. you're basically doing ongoing treatment planning by indicating in your progress note what you're planning to do and what your client is planning to do until the next session. Here's a list of the minimum requirements for progress notes, meaning the things that must be included in every progress note you complete according to best practices. First, the date of service. That's obvious. When did you provide the service? Month, day, year. Service intervention or service code. This is something you'll get taught at your agency. Certain services require certain codes. For example, the code that you use for assessment is going to be different than the code that you use for a regular treatment session. And this is because they're billed a little bit differently and have different caps in terms of time. The location in which the services were provided. Was it at the office? Was it at home, in the community, telehealth, and so on. The time spent with the client, which is considered the amount of billable hours. How much time were you with them? Usually in minutes. A typical session is going to be between 50 and 60 minutes. Documentation of the specific services or interventions provided. This will be when I teach you about GIRP notes in a minute, the I section. Your client response to the intervention, your R section in the GIRP note. Progress toward their goals for that treatment efficacy component. Your plan between sessions, which can include referrals, resources, and discharge planning, your signature, and if you're not fully licensed, the co-signature of your supervisor. And then just a note to make you aware of in terms of time and frequency, progress notes must be written after every session. So you must have a progress note for each session that you have with a client. And now agencies are moving more and more toward requiring those notes to be completed within 24 hours, which is called a 24-hour turnaround. Okay, so now I'm going to go into more depth about the main components of notes. And since the majority of you will be working at a DMH contracted site during your practicum or at some point in your career, I'll begin with the DMH format, which is the most commonly used format. Notes written for DMH billing should be written in GIRP format, which is indicated here, GIRP, Goal Interventions Response Plan. And I'm going to go through each of these sections with you. First, you have the goal. The goal is the easiest part of a progress note because you're simply copy pasting it from your treatment plan into your progress note. And if you're using an electronic charting system, you can usually just double click on the goal and it'll plug it in right there for you. You are not writing a new goal for every progress note. This does not make sense, okay? Every service you provide in your sessions should be aligned with a goal that you've already established for your client. So there's no need to write a new goal for every single session. If you have 2 treatment goals in the treatment plan, which is quite common, you're going to select the goal that you worked on in this particular session and plug it into your progress note. So if you have a goal about addressing behavior and another goal about talking about feelings, if the focus of your session was talking about feelings, you would use the feelings goal for that particular note. You're then indicating progress toward the goal. Has the client met the goal, partially met the goal, or not met the goal? And I have a sample here for you. So here is the goal. Client will increase use of relaxation strategies. And this again would be plugged in directly from the treatment plan. This is the collaborative SMART goal that you've developed with your client, written on the treatment plan and had everybody sign. Okay, so not a new goal. And then a little brief sentence about progress toward the goal. In this case, client has partially met goal this week. They were able to use relaxation strategies 1 time per day, most days. Okay, this is sufficient for the G goal section of the GIRP note. The next piece is the intervention. And here you're describing what you, the therapist, did during the session. This is the bulk of your note, and in my opinion, is the most important part of the note because it provides the most justification for your billing, medical necessity, and role as a therapist. It is where you get to show that you actually did therapy. In terms of length, it should be about 4 to 6 sentences, or if you're using bullet points, 4 to 6 bullet points for a 60-minute note. More importantly, though, the substance of this section should justify billing for the length of your session. The intervention section is written in past tense since you already had the session when you're writing this, and it should be written in 3rd person. The specific components, certain things you might want to include in this section are written here. These aren't required for every single session since each session will be a little bit different. But if you're struggling to figure out, well, what should I include here? These are some things to think about. Now I have a sample here of an intervention section written for a 60-minute session. As I mentioned earlier, you could also write this in a bullet point format, which I'll show you next, but I want to bring your attention to a couple things here. So notice the number of sentences. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences. So it's within that 4 to 6 sentences. And it's written in past tense. Therapist met with client to discuss progress toward meeting goal. Therapist provided positive reinforcement to continue to encourage client to work toward goal, and so on and so on and so on. So if you were to read this note, hopefully you feel that it justifies an hour-long session. I've got some role playing in here. I've got some processing, some discussion of triggers, discussing progress toward goal at the beginning, and then a homework assignment at the end. Now, again, you can put this into bullet point format, and I've just converted that same narrative into bullet points. I find that numbering them is more helpful than just straight up bullets, and you'll see why when we get to the response section. The benefit to doing it this way in bullets is that you don't need transition sentences, and you can structure your response the same way using the bullet points. This may also be easier if you tend to have writer's block a lot. It just may flow a little easier for you. Ultimately, it doesn't matter which one you pick, as long as, again, it's justifying the service, consistent with the medical necessity and the diagnosis, and you're working toward the goal. All right, next is the response. And the response section of your progress note shows what the client did during the session. So whereas the intervention is showing what you, the therapist, did, the response is showing how the client responded to the therapy session. Some words that you might use in this section are listed here, but basically we're wanting to see what the client's response was to your intervention. How did they act during the session? So here is a sample response. What's really important here is that your client's response makes sense given what you said you did during the intervention. So if I'm saying in the intervention that I explored barriers to progress with the client, but my response is talking about how the client responded to using play therapy to explore her family of origin issues, this doesn't make sense. So when writing your response, it can be helpful to write a response sentence for each or for most of the sentences from your intervention. So having them side by side or referring back to the intervention as you write the response to make sure that it flows. Once again, you can write this in bullet points, and I'll show you that next, but let's take a look here. So in my first sentence of the intervention, for example, I say therapist met with client to discuss progress toward meeting goal. So my first sentence in the response is about that. Clients shared that she was able to use relaxation strategies 1 time per day on most days. And then I have a bit more elaboration, shared that the one she found most helpful was meditation. Then in my intervention, I say I provided positive reinforcement. And so I want to have a response. How did the client respond to that positive reinforcement? And it says the client was receptive to praise and stated she felt encouraged. And so I continue in that way, lining things up as I go so that it makes sense that the intervention and the response happened in the same session. In bullet point, it would look something like this. And remember, I said that numbering could be helpful. And so in this case, I have a number to correspond to each of the numbers in my intervention. So if we go to number 4, for example, guided client in applying problem-solving skills to proactively plan for addressing barriers. And then I go to number 4 in the response, client decided she could share the reason why she's practicing meditation with her close friends so they could support her. You see that those line up. Okay, the problem-solving skill and plan was to share the reason why she's practicing meditation with her friends. Okay, and then again, number 7, I say I assigned homework. So in number 7 in the response, the client was receptive to the homework. Okay. All right. The plan is the final piece of the GIRP note where you're describing plans for between session time. It has 2 parts to it, which sometimes gets forgotten. The first part is the therapist's plan, what you are going to do between sessions. And the second part is the client's plan, what the client is going to do between sessions. Here's a sample. Therapist will check in with client during the middle of the week to assess progress with discussing meditation with friends. Okay, so there's what the therapist is going to do between sessions. And then client will journal feelings and use of relaxation strategies every day and bring journal to next session. So what the client is going to do. And here we have the final product. You have the narrative version on the left and the bullet point version on the right. Okay, you can pause this or look at the PowerPoint to look through it, but all of this is just copy pasted from the other slides where I've gone over each of these sections with you. But I want you to see how these would look in a final version of a progress note. So in your traineeship and later career, you'll enter these notes directly into your electronic chart using the template that it gives you. There'll be boxes that you'll enter text in for each section. Okay. If you're in private practice and you're not using an electronic charting system for some reason, you could also write these out in Word or by hand if that's what you like, and print them out to put into the client's physical chart. For our class, you'll simply write them in Word or in your word processor of choice, like the samples that you see here. Okay. Now, while progress notes or treatment notes will be written in GIRP format, as I've already demonstrated, these are used once you've already completed a treatment plan and established those goals. Prior to this, when you don't have goals yet, such as when you're in the assessment phase or the treatment planning phase, you'll write what is called a non-GIRP note. These are basically written as a single paragraph note with specific components for each type of note. Although they aren't in the traditional GIRP format, they still include some of the same types of information. And I'll show you an assessment note and a treatment note written in non-GIRP format in just a minute. What's important to remember here is the reason why you're writing a non-GIRP format note is because you don't have your goals yet. You haven't created them yet with the client, or you haven't completed the treatment plan and signed the treatment plan yet for those goals to be effective, but you still need to indicate what you're doing in session because you're going to bill for those assessment sessions and those treatment planning sessions. So a non-GIRP format note is used. So here's an example of what a non-GIRP note might look like for an assessment session, and it's on the right. Okay, on the left, I have things to include. Once again, remember that the length and substance of the note needs to justify the time spent during the session. And even though you're not writing it in GIRP format, it can still be helpful to try to structure it in that way, just minus the goal. For the assessment note, you want to make sure to include which sections of the assessment you completed in that assessment session. So if you're completing the DMH initial assessment, for example, you're going to list which specific sections of that assessment you completed. And so I have that here in the third sentence. Therapist began initial assessment with client and completed the reason for referral, MSE, and crisis evaluation with client. You also want to include any key or important information gathered during this portion of the assessment. So I have below that, client shared a desire to improve his ability to manage his anxiety, which is causing difficulty in his social relationships and work performance. Client's MSE was within normal limits, with his mood and affect being congruent and consistent with his presentation for anxiety. During the crisis evaluation, client denied current suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation, SIB, and psychosis, and denied any history of these crisis issues. Okay. That piece will very likely be the bulk of your assessment note, the key information. You also want to include a plan for completing the assessment. So what are you going to do next? And that's at the very end of my note. Therapist will meet with client later this week to complete the psychosocial history component of the assessment. And finally, this is a good place to document having gone over consents and confidentiality. And that's at the very beginning of my note. Therapist went over informed consent and limits of confidentiality with client. Client demonstrated understanding and asked questions when necessary. For those of you that are doing telehealth services, adding a sentence in there about telehealth and going over necessary consents for that would be helpful as well. All right. So we have a similar format for the treatment planning note where you're deciding on those goals. So first off, include collaboration between therapist and client to formulate goals. So I have that toward the middle here. Based upon this and the assessment results, the therapist worked with the client to develop 2 short-term treatment goals for therapy. Describe the actual goals. So this should be verbatim to what you're going to then include in the client treatment plan. So I have the first goal developed was, and then I have that goal written out, exactly how it's going to be in the treatment plan. And then plan for the treatment of these goals. In this case, I'm saying that I'm going to have another treatment planning session, so I don't have the plan yet. Instead, I wrote, during next session, therapist will explore intervention and activity ideas with client to finalize treatment plan. If you happen to complete the treatment plan in this session, then you would describe very briefly what those interventions were going to be in your treatment plan and finish it up. All right. So not every agency that you work with will use the GIRP format for note writing. So to end the lecture, I'm going to briefly introduce you to a few other formats that you may encounter during your traineeship or later as you're applying for jobs and such. The first is the Burp format. And in this case, the IRP, intervention response plan, is exactly the same as in the GIRP format. You have an intervention, a response, and a plan. What's different here is that instead of writing the goal, the G part, you have a B, behavior part, where you're providing some information about the client's behaviors, actions, statements, and so on. So first, you're providing information from the client. What are their observations, thoughts, and direct quotes? For example, perhaps the client shares that they feel worse than when they started therapy. That would be something to include in this B section. Next, you're providing your own observations as the therapist about the client during the session. So for example, does the client appear disengaged, distracted, uninterested, super engaged, really motivated, and so on. So you're describing basically what the client did in a sense, but not in as much depth in the response. And then your objective data, what did you observe about the session? Affect, mood, appearance, okay? And you can use direct quotes in this section for the subjective data, okay? All right, another format is SOAP. And here the S and the O take from the Burp format and expand on them with more depth. You have a specific section for the subjective and a specific section for the objective. And then here, instead of providing the IRP, you actually have instead an assessment of the client's progress and functioning, and that's your A. Okay, so S and O, just like the behavior section of the Burp, A for assessment takes the place of your IR, your intervention and response. And then finally, you have a plan with a couple more specifics than we had in the GIRP or Burp format. They want to know next meeting date, planned activities, and follow-up support. Okay. And then finally, we have the DAP format. Here, once again, we have the subjective and objective information, but both of those are combined like they are in the Burp note into the data section of the DAP note. And you also will include your content and process of the session, which can be thought of as your intervention section and maybe some of the response section from the GIRP note. Then you have your assessment, which is the same as what we discussed in the SOAP note, and your plan, which again is the same as the SOAP note. Okay. So although the formats are all different, you can see how they overlap in a lot of ways, and you're including much of the same information, just kind of structured in a bit of a different way. And of course, remember that this is only here as an introduction. You're going to get much more training on the format your agency uses when you go in to start there, whether in your practicum or in your role as an associate. Hopefully, though, this is a helpful introduction. You won't be blindsided when you start learning about these notes, and you'll at least be familiar with some of the content and some samples of how to go ahead and write this so that you have a leg up on this skill. All right, but that is all. So I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you, as always, for listening.